Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Elijah Sadaphal. He is an emergency physician, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Why Quitting Medicine is Hard. Elijah, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Yes. So I finished my residency in emergency medicine in Philadelphia 16 years ago. I then moved immediately to the greater New York area and worked in the emergency room for 7 years before I transitioned to urgent care full time. And that's where I've been working for the last 8 years.
All right. So as an urgent care physician, tell me some of the challenges facing urgent care today.
Well, it's an interesting question to answer, because what we've noticed in the last year is that essentially urgent care in a large part of the 5 boroughs of New York City has now become the front door to medicine in general. And I say that because there are a lot of barriers to entry to many patients getting in to see their doctor, whether it's delay or getting a negative COVID test before they're seen. So in a lot of areas where my group works, we are that first doc. So if you haven't had a physical in 3 years or your blood pressure checked, urgent care ends up being the first place where patients come to get to see a doctor.
And tell me some typical cases that you're seeing now. We're speaking in the middle to end of June. So what are some typical cases that you're seeing now in urgent care?
Roughly 40% of the patients that we see is now just straight COVID testing, either to attend a game, a graduation, or to travel. Maybe 20 to 30% is going to be URIs and allergies, and the rest is going to be routine physicals, STDs testing, sore throat, and cough.
What is the proportion of urgent cares that are staffed by emergency physicians? Because around where I am, a lot of urgent cares are being staffed by advanced practice practitioners, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners. So in general, what are some of the trends regarding urgent cares being staffed by emergency physicians?
In general, based on my own personal experience, the demand to have exclusive emergency physicians has gone way down. And the group for which I work, for example, I would say roughly there's a 60-40 split between emergency docs and family practitioners. And then you also have, PAs and NPs who also fall under the same banner.
All right, so let's transition into the Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled, Why Quitting Medicine is Hard. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read that article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
The basic gist of the article is that it addresses the psychological difficulty many physicians may have where they are contemplating and considering a career in non-clinical medicine, but because medicine is, there's such a great barrier to get into medicine, many feel paralyzed in thinking there's no way I could ever leave. They may lose their academic position, they may lose their paycheck, etc. So the article basically encourages clinicians to basically say, hey, this is not only possible, but it's actually very doable. And the barriers that many providers may think are insurmountable actually aren't that much.
What are some of the perceived barriers that you talk about in your article that physicians may face when they're thinking about leaving clinical medicine?
So one barrier may be there seems to be a stigma that many providers face that they would be, quote unquote, selling out or abandoning their patients if they moved out of the office into a non-clinical setting, which in reality isn't true. The world of non-clinical medicine is exceedingly broad, and we live, here's a concrete example. We live in a day and age where, anyone could Google any symptom and get 25 different answers. And the amount of dis and misinformation, it's overflowing. So one avenue a clinician could go into is basically being an educator or a teacher and providing, resources online that patients can get reliable, trustworthy medical advice about what it is they're going through. So you're still helping patients. It's just in a different context.
And from your experience and from talking to your colleagues, what are some reasons physicians have for potentially leaving clinical medicine?
Some people are frustrated, and definitely in urgent care in New York, since many people in our position bore the brunt of the first wave of the pandemic over the past year. A lot of people are just spent and psychologically frustrated, and they're now going on fumes. So it may just be a therapeutic change of scenery, or people wanting a new intellectual challenge to take the next step in their career.
And you mentioned being an educator as one avenue outside of clinical medicine. What are some other examples of avenues outside of clinical medicine that some physicians may pursue?
You could write content on social media. Or you could also write content for urgent care. So if patients were coming to your urgent care site and were seeking general information articles on a sore throat or a cough, you could be the individual that writes information. You could also be a regulatory writer, someone who writes proposals to the federal authorities, get approval for a new drug, or even do needs assessments where you're basically looking for people to sponsor CME activities.
And where can physicians find some of these opportunities?
A great place to start, and this is the company that I use, is called Seek, S-E-A-K. So if you were to Google Seek non-clinical careers, they basically have a host of courses and programs you can take where there are other providers who have made that transition from clinical to non-clinical medicine, and they have a lot of valuable resources.
Now, before a physician considers leaving clinical medicine, what are some steps in between? Should they be seeking help to find reasons why they could stay in clinical medicine, or should they be seeking other support services before they leave clinical medicine entirely?
Oh, of course. I mean, it's far, considering the amount of education and training, any provider has to go through, the path of least resistance is to stay. So the first question someone should ask is, if there's a barrier between where they are and them being happy, the first question to ask is the problem correctable? And if the problem is, there is no dilemma. They basically remain where they are. But the two biggest things that I think someone needs to do is to get in touch with a mentor, someone who's actually made the transition, and always make sure they're transitioning to something and not merely escaping from something. Because if you're merely escaping from something, then you're not actually going to make any actionable forward progress.
Now, from your experience, are you seeing a lot of physicians leave clinical medicine 100%, or are they doing perhaps a 50-50 split where they do some shifts in whatever clinical setting they're in and the other 50% are doing non-clinical endeavors?
Usually from what I've seen, the transition is always gradual, only because with rare exceptions, the income a provider would make in a non-clinical career would be less than a clinical one. So they would begin maybe 95-5 clinical, non-clinical, and then over a period of 6 to 18 months, wean down one while they increase the other.
So I talk to a lot of physicians on this podcast, and a lot of physicians write on my blog about physician burnout, about moral injury, and it's not just in urgent care, but in primary care and in pretty much every specialty as well. Now, take me through the thought process of that physician who is considering a career outside of clinical medicine. Tell me the questions they should be asking themselves. And you did mention Seek as one place, but walk me through the workflow that they should be undergoing.
So there's a great book. The author's name escapes me, but the title of the book is Did I Waste All That Training? And essentially, there's a 5-step process. It's introspection, exploration, networking, preparation, and acquisition. And in that 5-step process, the number one thing any provider has to spend time on is introspection, where they have to ask themselves why. Start with why. Why am I unhappy where I am? Why do I want to change? What do I expect and where I want to go? and essentially making a concrete list of the things that you like and dislike about where you are now, and then writing down as well, what would be your ideal job? What is it you want the most? And then you evaluate, is where you are now matching your ideal, and then consider how would your ideal more closely align with your goals. So you begin with earnest introspection and consider not only where you are, but why you want to go where you want to go.
And from your experience and from the people that you talk to, has anyone regretted leaving clinical medicine?
It's funny you ask, because one of the individuals that that mentored me, when she made her initial switch, she began going into being a lecturer and, being a speaker all across the country. And she actually found out she hated it. Mm-hmm. And it's from that dislike of doing that, she then tried something new and then discovered medical writing. So on the one hand, there are a handful of people who originally disliked what they went into, but that's the beauty of keeping your options open and not to have a tunnel vision about the thing I'm going to do is X, Y, Z, because you won't know till you try it.
We're talking to Elijah Sadaphal. He's an emergency physician, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Why Quitting Medicine is Hard. Elijah, you mentioned about the stigma about some physicians leaving clinical medicine, and there's a perception that doctors who don't see patients, they're not considered real doctors, in quotations. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, and what's your response to people who think doctors who don't see patients, who seek careers outside of clinical medicine, who proverbially sell out, aren't considered real physicians?
Yeah, I think when we all took the oath to do no harm, that oath didn't only apply to, having a white coat and a stethoscope on and seeing people in the hospital or the office. And in the interest of patients, how we help them as doctors is very, very broad. One person could be in the research lab, one person in the operating room, one person in urgent care, one person could be, behind their desk writing a book. So the goal isn't really us. The goal is to help people, to educate them, to empower them, and to essentially expand not only their lives, but also their health. And when you think about it that way, we're all members of a body, and each, organ does a different thing.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
That for any provider, any physician who's contemplating a non-clinical career, it is very doable, it is very accessible, and there are already thousands and thousands of people doing it. So if you so choose, the first thing to do is to introspect and then begin exploring.
Elijah, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin. My pleasure.